The city of Alexandria is situated in the northern part of Egypt, where the Nile widens like a web at its famous delta and flows into the Mediterranean Sea after winding thousands of miles through the desert. Today, Alexandria has the second largest population in Egypt after Cairo. From the time it was founded in 332 BC by Alexander the Great, it remained the capital of Egypt until the death of Cleopatra, when the kingdom became part of the Roman Empire and one of the richest provinces in North Africa. The rapid urbanization of Alexandria has made it difficult to find treasures in the ancient city center, where ruins remain buried beneath city streets and buildings. The situation is quite different than it is in the religious centers of Karnak and Luxor, and the ancient city of Thebes, where streets, buildings, and huge monuments still allow us to imagine their original splendor. The Alexandria of Cleopatra's time, the marvelous city the queen loved more than any other, has therefore been lost forever. However, if we look closely, we can still piece together the way in which Cleopatra lived and the reasons Alexandria was such a powerful capital. Cleopatra was the last descendant of the great pharaohs and a highly educated woman. Her great cunning and romantic liaisons with Roman generals Julius Caesar and Mark Antony allowed her to hold on to this magnificent city and keep Alexandria intact. For more than 2,000 years, Alexandria was the largest city of Egypt. Its great port and the way it was laid out by Alexander the Great allowed it to grow quickly. When Cleopatra took over in 51 BC, it was the commercial and political hub of the Egyptian Empire. We can imagine Cleopatra looking out lovingly over her city, perhaps from a perch in the magnificent lighthouse on the island of Pharos. The stones from the fallen lighthouse now lie crumbled in the sea. But when it was built in 280 BC, the lighthouse of Pharos at Alexandria was one of the 7 wonders of the world. From its high balcony, Cleopatra could see her extensive kingdom in every direction as far as 60 miles away. Of the famous 7 wonders, that is, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, the Pharos of Alexandria, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, and the Pyramids of Giza. Only the pyramids are still standing today. The few remains that were left of the Pharos of Alexandria were incorporated into a fortress at the port. The lighthouse was built by the architect Sostratos of Cnidus near the middle of the 3rd century BC, and during the reign of Ptolemy II, Philadelphos, one of Cleopatra's ancestors. Numerous earthquakes had damaged the lighthouse until, in 1480, Sultan Qaid Bai had the fortress built using many of the remains of the lighthouse. Some granite columns are still visible on the main door and on the boundary walls that plunge into the sea. The lighthouse, along with the other 5 lost wonders of the ancient world, is shrouded in mystery. What did it really look like? How big was it? Considering that Egypt had so little wood, what material did they use to keep the great beacon burning? There are some drawings and descriptions from travelers who visited the lighthouse before it was destroyed, but they tend to be confusing. What does exist, however, although it was never made public, is a small-scale copy of the lighthouse in perfect condition, made in the same period as the real one. It is here in a place called Abu Sir, a village nearly 25 miles from Alexandria. The archaeological remains of the ancient city of Taposiris Manya, a thriving North African city during Cleopatra's lifetime, surround the village. This lighthouse, just over 50 feet high, doesn't have the majesty of the Pharos, but it does give us an idea of what it must have looked like. The Great Lighthouse was 3 stories high, with the first story square, the second octagonal, and the third circular. Perhaps it wasn't the only one of its kind built. The coastline between Alexandria and Taposiris could have had many such lighthouses. If we project this architectural model upon the old fort in Alexandria, we can see what the Great Lighthouse looked like. It is a 3-story structure surrounded at the base by some small temples and an enclosure. The light it projected could be seen tens of miles away, and even to this day, we still wonder how that was possible. They must have used reflecting mirrors, but the fuel must have been wood, hard to find in the area, or straw mixed with animal dung, a compound that emitted great heat but little light. Archaeologists have recently guessed that the enclosure was for storing flammable material, perhaps petroleum that was already being used in those days. For Cleopatra, who might have wanted to look for a sailing ship on the horizon bringing messages from Rome, the building was perfect. It was 500 feet high, a record for a monument of the ancient world. The history of Egypt's last years is closely related to the life of its great queen. Cleopatra descended from the dynasty of the Ptolemies, founded by Ptolemy I Soter, a Macedonian general under Alexander the Great. There is debate as to what she looked like. She is portrayed on some coins, perhaps inaccurately, with a protruding chin and a prominent nose. Yet she surely must have been charming and charismatic, and we know she was determined and strong-willed and undoubtedly a shrewd politician. At the beginning of her reign, when she was only 15 years old, Cleopatra embarked on a southbound journey up the Nile, officially for religious reasons. As the pharaoh, her presence had been requested at a place called Armont, just south of Thebes, to participate in a ceremony. It may have been on this trip that Cleopatra for the first time saw the Great Pyramids of Giza near Cairo. She was probably as stunned as we are today to see these massive and beautiful monuments. Structures built over 2,000 years before Cleopatra was born. The pharaohs before her had constructed the pyramids as tombs for themselves and their immediate families, and as temples of worship. Cleopatra often took trips within her kingdom. Apart from her normal duties as sovereign, she wanted to make sure that her dynasty was continuing the legacy started by the pharaohs who preceded her. She must have sailed up the Nile to the city of Dendera, on the river's left bank, because the greatest development of both the city and temple of Dendera date from Cleopatra's time, the last period of the Ptolemaic dynasty. They are examples of the notable architecture accomplished during Cleopatra's reign. Burned by the sun and wind and swallowed up by the desert sand, almost nothing remains of the ancient city of Dendera today, except for one imposing structure that's still standing, the enclosed sanctuary with a temple dedicated to the goddess Hathor. Hathor, wife of Horus and mother of Ihi, god of music, was the ancient Egyptian goddess of love and was generally depicted with human features. Horus was the son of Isis, the mother god of Egypt, and of Osiris, god of the underworld and judge of the dead. The personal implications connected to worshiping these powerful gods was surely the main reason why Cleopatra was interested in the sanctuary. These implications are still legible in stone and are one of the most interesting enigmas of ancient Egyptian history. In ancient times, Dendera was called Tantere, but under the Ptolemaic dynasty it was known as Tantiris, its Greek name. Cleopatra would have been familiar with both names, since, according to ancient sources, she spoke 7 languages. To this day, the sanctuary appears like a real city surrounded by mighty walls, 330 yards long on both sides. The main gate, obviously added later, dates from the time of Roman emperors Domitian and Trajan, who were ruling the land 200 years after Cleopatra's death. Through the gateway, we can see the front of the gigantic temple of Hathor. As she walked through the front portal and looked up toward the sky to the molding above, Cleopatra would have seen the benevolent rays of the sun, represented as giant wings. On the inside, there is a depiction of one of the countless images symbolizing motherhood that are scattered around the temple. It illustrates the goddess Isis seated, breastfeeding little Horus, the future husband of Hathor. Along the temple's side wall, we can see Hathor breastfeeding Ihi in the presence of a pharaoh paying them homage. Many temples of this period had colonnaded courtyards leading up to them. The Temple of Dendera, instead, went without a colonnade to make the front of the building more imposing. The 6 gigantic columns of the building itself are connected at the bottom by a wall and crushed by a hefty cornice to form the entrance to the vestibule. Entering the temple was considered an initiation and spiritual voyage. Cleopatra, the only non-priest who would be allowed inside, would find herself walking through a series of rooms where the natural light would grow dimmer and dimmer until she reached the most sacred place in the sanctuary, the cella, where the statue of the god was placed. Then the light would take on an almost mystical brightness, a reflection of the god's metaphysical presence. A number of staircases connect the temple to the terrace above. It is here that statues for worshiping the goddess Hathor were brought in a solemn procession once a year, so that they could unite with the rays of Ra, the sun god. From the terrace, we can see the many buildings in the sanctuary. This is the sanatorium, like a hospital, with many small rooms where the sick used to wait for the goddess to visit them with a cure for their ailments. This well-preserved building is one that dates from the period when Egypt was already a Roman province. It is the Mamesi of Trajan. The Mamesi is a very common building in Egypt, a sacred place where rites were performed connected to the birth of the son of the sacred couple who were worshipped in the main temple. The Mamesi at Dendera is dedicated to Ihi, Hathor's son. This relief depicts his birth, feeding, and growth. Standing out from those who are worshipping the sacred child is this figure, dressed like a pharaoh, whom we meet in the main temple. But he's not Egyptian. The hieroglyphic text identifies him as Nero, the Roman emperor. These figures on the boat of life are Emperors Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. On the south side of the temple, shaped like lions' heads, are gargoyles, which, besides being decorative, carried rainwater to the outside of the building. The figures sculpted in the wall below them convey an entire scenario, this time instigated by Cleopatra. This gigantic bas-relief depicts Cleopatra introducing her son Caesarion, whom she had had with Julius Caesar, to the goddess Isis, who is preceded by her son Horus, represented as a child. What was Cleopatra trying to communicate with this original relief? According to a recent study, The similarity of Cleopatra's and Caesarion's position with the position of the two gods is thought to be a mirror image of Isis and Horus. But that's not all. Osiris, Isis' husband, who was killed by his enemies, is not portrayed in the bas-relief, and neither is Caesar, who was slain by Brutus and the senators. By this clear similarity with the powerful goddess, the great queen wished to be considered as the new Isis. And as a goddess, she reminded the Romans that she was the only legitimate sovereign of Egypt. Another great sanctuary of the Ptolemaic period that Cleopatra must have visited on one of her trips to the south is the one dedicated to Isis on Philae. Because of its great beauty, the island of Philae was called the Pearl of the East by travelers in ancient times, and has been a favorite of artists and painters throughout history. The unusually beautiful monumental complex almost disappeared when it was being swallowed up by Lake Nasser. In 1968, UNESCO and the Egyptian Ministry of Culture called for the international community to help. An Italian company, led by architect Giovanni Iopolo, was called upon to meticulously rescue this architectural beauty. He had the entire complex taken down and put up again on the island of Agilkia, about 330 yards away from its original site. This is where the sanctuary still stands today. It took almost 7 years to finish the work of surveying, taking down, transporting, restoring, and reassembling the millions of stone blocks that made up the original sanctuary. The temple, which was erected in its present form by the Ptolemies in the first half of the 3rd century BC, is dedicated to Isis as the creator of life. She is portrayed there in numerous bas-reliefs as the goddess who brought her husband Osiris back to life after he was murdered by his brother Seth. Pilgrims traveled to the temple from every part of Africa and beyond. Even the Roman emperors were devoted to the goddess. Proof of this is found in the elegant pavilion that the Emperor Trajan had built. Despite its monumental appearance, it was an airy structure that was large enough for processions to enter inside. The sanctuary at Philae was the last center of the ancient Egyptian religion. In the Christian era, when various churches were erected beside the temple using the pagan monuments of the sanctuary, the temple continued to be considered the house of the goddess Isis, the great mother of Egypt. The goddess did not seem extraneous to Christians. The depiction of Isis breastfeeding Horus is the forerunner of the Madonna and Child. Also, the salutation to the god Amun, who was worshipped to a lesser extent on Philae, became the famous Amen, the Hebrew and Christian salutation. The splendid sanctuary at Dendera and the incredibly beautiful and spiritual one on Philae were places that were always dear to Cleopatra's heart until the end. According to Egyptian religious belief, by dying bitten by a snake, a creature sacred to Isis, she secured eternal life. When Cleopatra went to Rome in 47 BC with the son she had had with Julius Caesar, the magical civilization she represented followed her to the new capital of the world. Rome was mesmerized by the tantalizing queen and her culture, and began building Egyptian-type monuments in Rome itself. It was built by Gaius Cestius, who died in 12 BC. The pyramid is completely covered in white Carrara marble and was built in record time, a little less than 300 days. Cleopatra would have loved the irony of her conquerors copying her country's treasures. The obelisks were the first great masterpieces of Egyptian civilization brought to Rome. Though some Greeks and Romans mocked them, The Greeks called them obeliskoi, or skewers, while the Romans called them Cleopatra's needles. The obelisks were placed in front of temples as monuments connected to worshipping the sun, and were generally covered in hieroglyphics. One of the many mysteries that shrouded Egyptian civilization was how these gigantic columns were built and carried to Rome, considering that they are monoliths, meaning that they are cut out of a single stone block. These are some of the largest Egyptian obelisks in Rome, the city that boasts the largest number of them. This obelisk is situated in the Piazza San Giovanni in Laterano. Originally from Thebes, it is made of red granite and is the tallest obelisk in Rome. Emperor Constantius had it moved to Rome in 357 AD. The obelisk in the Piazza del Popolo was erected by the great pharaoh Ramses II. Originally it was at Heliopolis, but Emperor Augustus had it moved to Rome in 10 BC to commemorate the 20th anniversary of Cleopatra's defeat. Over the years, Rome's collection of statuary, bas-relief, and precious objects from Egypt grew. The Capitoline museums house many statues of Egyptian gods and sphinxes, like this one in red Aswan granite that dates from the time of Cleopatra. It was found in 1856 in the Via Sant'Ignazio in Rome, a street in the city center where much evidence of Egyptian sculptures has been found. But that's not all. A number of excavations have confirmed the presence of an Egyptian temple in the heart of Rome, a possibility that seemed unbelievable before. Here in the zone of the ancient Campus Martius, a great temple existed that was dedicated to Isis and Serapis, an Egyptian god invented by one of Cleopatra's ancestors. The monument has been completely lost, but it looked much like the other famous Egyptian temples, those on Philae and at Dendera. The Romans were not the only ones who came here. The Egyptians did too. Their community, the largest group of foreigners living in Rome, is located in the present-day quarter of Trastevere. Cleopatra probably never imagined she would have such influence on the Romans. The passion, interest in, and enthusiasm for all things Egyptian that has engrossed Europeans over the ages is the legacy of this educated and refined queen, the shrewd politician and loving mother who never lost her concern for the needs of her people. After the dark shadow cast on her personality by the Roman victors, Cleopatra's image has now taken on a brighter light, though there is still some debate among scholars as to what she really looked like. According to some writers, she was beautiful. To others, she was not. The few Egyptian portraits we have, like the one at Dendera, are sketchy, and there are far too many portraits, busts, and statues believed to be her that it is hard to know which is the true depiction. Perhaps it would have remained one more unsolved mystery if it hadn't been for art historian Paolo Moreno. He believed that the Esquiline Venus housed at the Capitoline museums is in reality a full-figure portrait of Cleopatra, done while she was living in Rome. Many scholars now share this belief. Seeing her portrait in this statue is like bringing the great queen back to life. Cleopatra herself would have loved this, for one of her strong beliefs was the saying, "Keeping your face is keeping your soul." In many hearts, the face and soul of Cleopatra live forever. For more than 1,000 years, millions of people traveled to Delphi to seek answers from the oracle of Apollo. His advice was especially sought by colonists setting off to discover new lands. First, there were the uncharted and perhaps dangerous waters that they intended to cross. And second was simply the religious and spiritual importance of the sanctuary at Delphi at that time. Standing almost 2,000 feet above the sea, between the Gulf of Corinth and Mount Parnassus, Delphi was the Greek or Hellenic world's most famous sanctuary. Some of the greatest masterpieces of Greek art were concentrated around the temple. Today, all that is left of the statues that once adorned the sanctuary are their bases. They were colossal sculptures made of very expensive materials, and there were thousands of them. The sight of them heightened the pilgrims' expectations. There was the bronze bull, donated by the inhabitants of the island of Corfu in 480 BC. This was in honor of a bull who dove into the sea, leading fishermen to a great catch of tuna. And the splendid bronze copy of the celebrated Trojan horse, donated by the inhabitants of Argos in thanks for the spoils of war from a victory over the Spartans. But the centerpiece of the sanctuary was the Temple of Apollo, the god that oversees all beginnings, the protector of order and harmony. For those who made the pilgrimage to Delphi in search of answers, the temple was an impressive sight. It had 6 columns made of tuff along its front and 15 on each side. The frontons were faced with marble. In the pronaos, or portico in front of the cella, famous maxims were inscribed on the columns such as, "All things in moderation," and "Know thyself," phrases which capture the deepest essence of Greek wisdom. But it was the words of Apollo, transmitted through his oracle, that resonated most deeply with the Greeks. The oracle's predictions were transmitted through the frenzied words of an old priestess who interpreted the answers of the god. In a cave, the faithful awaited the response from the priestess, who, in a state of trance, recited prophetic words regarding the route to follow and where they should land. By following these directions, and probably those of sailors as well, the first Greeks reached the shores of the island of Ischia in the Gulf of Naples about 2,800 years ago. This marked the beginning of the Greek colonization of southern Italy, a vast territory given the name of Magna Graecia, which in Latin means Great Greece. But what was Magna Graecia? Basically, a group of polis, or city-states, whose wealth and power would soon exceed that of the Greek cities of the motherland. For the Greek settlers, used to the searing sun, aridness, and mountains of their homeland, Italy was a true paradise on earth, with its mild climate, abundant watercourses, and fertile plains. From the first cities sprang more. The inhabitants of Sybaris, founded by Peloponnesian Greeks, built Poseidonia, now Paestum. The people of Cumae, originally founded by Greeks from the island of Euboea, created Parthenope, which was to become the Athens of the West and is now known as Naples. Many of the residents of Naples are thus of Greek origin, direct descendants of those early settlers from Euboea. Naples is the commercial and cultural heart of the Mezzogiorno, Italy's south, the promised land of the ancient Greeks. Excavations for the new subway line through the center of Naples have turned out to be a window on the city's past. Work in such sites as Piazza Municipio has uncovered not only the old Aragonese walls, but also provided a chance to view a much deeper cross-section of the city's historical layers. Archaeologists from the Naples Monuments and Fine Arts Service have found numerous objects of Greek origin, such as the small fragment of an Attica vase dating back to the 4th century BC, decorated with the figure of an owl. Naples remained a Greek city for many centuries, even during the domain of the Roman Empire. The Romans were fascinated by Greek culture, and for them, Naples represented Greece, only 120 miles from their home, an open door to the allure and refinement of the Orient. Along the hills of Posillipo, a name taken from the Greek Posilipon, meaning the place where one's troubles end and rest can be found, the wealthy Romans built dozens of beautiful villas. Wanting to blend in, the Romans were happy to exchange their togas for the Greek pallium, to converse in Greek, listen to Greek music, and commission copies of Greek works of art. But Naples was not just a tourist attraction, a sort of amusement park for the Romans. The city was a capital of culture in its own right, where one could be born, live, and die in the manner of the Greeks, as Virgil liked to say. And it was here in Naples that the great author of epics wrote the Aeneid. Reproductions of masterpieces of Greek sculpture were much sought after, a big business at the time. Thousands of masterpieces from the Parthenopean school flooded the world, a veritable legacy of Greek art. The rich Romans paid, and paid quite well, to have imitations of famous works of art grace their villas and gardens. Another aspect of Greek culture the Romans appreciated was theater. To stand on the stage of the Naples Theater was the dream of every artist, the consecration of a life, a yardstick of success. The ruins of the Naples Theater have been found buried under later constructions. If you go down into the basements of private residences now standing on the spot, you can discover what remains of the theater, made famous partly because it was the site of an exceptional premiere appearance. The Emperor Nero himself made his debut as a poet in this theater. Nero loved both poetry and music and performed many times on this stage before an audience whom he spoke with in Greek. Not far from the theater is a section of Naples named for the Virgins. Here, hidden behind this door, several yards underground, is a veritable treasure, a Greek hypogeum from the 3rd century BC. Hypogea were large subterranean chambers having the dual function of being a burial ground and a sanctuary. It was in the hypogea, for example, where ceremonies were held dedicated to the Oriental god Mithra, who was worshipped widely in Naples. This well-preserved one, the Crystallini Hypogeum, was built outside the city walls in an area that in ancient times was nothing but forests and fields. Everything here evokes Naples' ancient past, even though it is quite probable that the bones and skulls date back only to the 17th century, the period of the Great Plague during the Spanish rule. The discovery of the chamber only 100 years ago amazed archaeologists with its finely conserved state. There are votive edicula and delicately frescoed walls with figures still glowing in bright colors, and funerary urns for the mortal remains of the deceased. But what is perhaps most striking are the touching farewells to the departed, written in Greek on the walls. Here, a father addressed his daughter, Aristogoras, with touching simplicity. "Goodbye, my beloved daughter." In the central part of the city is the spacious Agora. This plaza was the center of the social life of the city and the site of its market. It is incredible, but shops like these under the arcades have been here for over 2,000 years. And it is amazing to note that these narrow streets all have the same width, about 10 feet, and are spaced at regular intervals of 115 feet. The explanation given by archaeologists is that the modern-day streets still follow more or less exactly the Greek streets that were laid out when the city was founded 2,500 years ago. An example is the present-day Via Tribunali, which follows one of the two principal axes of the Greek city, and is one of the few broad avenues in Naples. The Agora is also famous for its magnificent temples. The Church of San Paolo Maggiore is the classic example of a Christian edifice standing on the ruins of a pagan temple. The ancient temple was dedicated to the Dioscuri, Zeus's twin sons, who were doomed to live and die on alternating days. Only these two beautiful Corinthian columns remain. But when it was new, the temple existed on a grandiose scale. We can once again view the great temple as it appeared almost 2,000 years ago. Thanks to a Greek inscription found nearby, it turns out that the temple was restored in the 1st century AD during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius, at the expense of two rich liberti, freed slaves who had become administrators of the imperial family's wealth. Through recent studies that established the ancient route of the perimeter walls, archaeologists now have a view of the entire ancient city of Naples. The city is of modest size, but completely encircled by a mighty defensive system of walls and turrets, fortifications that stood up to Hannibal and his elephants during the Second Punic War. Yes, even Hannibal paid a visit to Naples. From the top of the walls, you could have witnessed the dramatic events recounted by the Roman historian Titus Livy that took place in the area near the present-day Piazza Dante in the heart of Naples. Livy wrote, "The cavalry of the Neapolitan army succeeded with rapid sorties to sow confusion in the enemy ranks and thus forced Hannibal to abandon his siege." Walking through the streets of modern-day Naples, you can see traces in the features and gazes of the Neapolitans of the incredible mix of races that marked this corner of the Magna Graecia during the Hellenic and Roman period. Egyptians, Romans, Italians, Illyrians, and Africans were all accepted within the city walls into the community founded by the Greeks, an exemplary demonstration of tolerance. Naples was only one of many Greek cities in Italy. Paestum, 60 miles to the south, was the location of a very important Greek sanctuary. We don't know exactly when Paestum was founded, but it certainly dates back to at least 600 years before the birth of Christ and was founded by settlers from Sybaris, another city of Magna Graecia. Paestum's importance in antiquity is evidenced by these walls that surrounded the inhabited areas. But the best testimony to its wealth are the great temples of the sanctuary, built in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. At that time, Paestum was known as Poseidonia, the Greek name for the city, in homage to the sea god Poseidon. This temple, improperly called a basilica by the early scholars, is the oldest one. It was dedicated to the goddess Hera, a divinity who was venerated as the goddess of fertility and maternity, and who would watch over women when they were about to give birth. The temple has 50 well-preserved columns that taper towards the top. The capitals and the temple decoration in general are in Doric style. About 100 years after the construction of the basilica, the inhabitants of Paestum built the so-called Temple of Poseidon in the immediate vicinity. Actually, we do not know to whom the temple was dedicated, but it is one of the best preserved of Magna Graecia. It had symmetrical fronts, with 6 columns along each shorter side and 14 columns along each longer one. The complex of the two temples comprised the sacred area. At the time, the sight of the two stone giants shining in the sunlight must have been a view of rare beauty. Another great temple of the city is the one dedicated to the goddess Athena. This temple is quite original to the expert's eye, since its external columns were Doric, while the columns and capitals around the cella, currently displayed in the Museum of Paestum, were Ionic. For modern scholars, this is the first known case of two different architectonic orders used in the same building. During medieval times, the temple was converted into a Christian church, as demonstrated by the tombs found inside. In the forum lies the so-called Italic Temple, or Capitolium, the first temple built by the Romans after the year 273 BC, when Poseidonia came under their domain and took the name of Paestum. This temple was rather exotic, starting with its high base, a lot different than those of the Greek temples. It was dedicated to the triad of divinities honored on the Capitoline Hill in Rome: Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. At the turn of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the temple occupied a part of the stairways of a pre-existing structure, the area of the Comitium, where the city assembly met in the open air. The area was packed with monuments, and in the distance was the great bulk of the amphitheater. Sacred rites in these temples were carried out under strict guidelines. Inside of the temple dedicated to the goddess Hera, for example, we find a large cella with 3 naves and a bi-level colonnade. But in ancient times, it was only the priests and initiates who were allowed to walk down the colonnade and enter religious buildings. Others would have to stop in the pronaos in front of the entrance. Every morning, the priests purified the cella with holy water and made offerings of food and drink to the large statue of the goddess. The door was the only opening in the cella. The wooden ceiling and the imposing statue of the goddess must have filled the hearts of the priests with an indescribably mystical sensation. The temples at Paestum have always fascinated the numerous people who visit them. In the 18th and 19th centuries, famous celebrities such as the archaeologist and art historian Winckelmann and the poets Goethe and Shelley would come to Italy on their grand tour as a kind of pilgrimage in search of beauty. Another fascinating Greek site not far from Naples is a small fishing village known as Potswili. In ancient times, it was called Dikyarchia, which in Greek means City of Justice. It was founded in 529 BC by refugees from the island of Samos, including the philosopher Pythagoras, who were fleeing the tyranny of Polycrates. The liberty they won was relatively short-lived. In 190 BC, a Roman colony was instituted on the ruins here that took the name of Puteoli, later becoming Potswili. On the promontory, the ancient acropolis of the city, the Romans built a large temple during the Augustan period. The temple was revealed again recently after a fire destroyed the church of San Proculo in 1963. Potswili was the most important port in the empire for descendants of the Greeks, Rome's true gateway to the sea. There were docks here for large cargo ships that transported goods all over the empire. Today, nothing remains of the ancient piers. Only a 19th century print that gives us a glimpse of its 15 arches. The economic and commercial importance of the city is evidenced by the Macellum, the market, second in size and variety of services only to that in Rome. The Macellum was also known as the Temple of Serapis, after the Greek divinity and patron of markets. In 1750, excavations in the Macellum were ordered by the King of Naples, Charles IV of the Bourbon dynasty. They immediately encountered a small mystery. The columns were pocked up to a certain height with strange and irregular holes. Studies showed that the holes were related to the phenomenon known as bradyseism, the rising and falling of the Phlegrean coast with respect to the sea. The temple was thus at times submerged by the sea, and when it rose again it was marked by these holes made by mollusks known as lithophaga. The Macellum comprised a large rectangular portico measuring 190 by 245 feet and enclosing the shops. It was an impressive and bustling marketplace. At the center of the internal courtyard, there was a round building, the tholos, decorated with marble sculptures and statues. The market was a riot of Mediterranean colors, a meeting place for many different peoples and languages, from Egyptian and Phoenician to Greek and Latin. On display were exotic products, spices, perfumes, ointments, Greek and Egyptian antiques, and naturally, a wide variety of products from the sea. In 1700, in the large apse behind the tholos, archaeologists found a statue of Serapis, after whom the entire complex was named. Not far from Potswilly, in another part of the Phlegrean fields, is the beautiful and unsettling Solfatara, the best-known volcanic crater in the Phlegrean area. The volcano has been dormant for at least 2,000 years, but its characteristic phenomena are still visible today. There are few places where one has the clear impression of the phrase, "fire in the belly of the earth." Tradition has it that giants were chained here after being defeated in a bitter fight with almighty Jupiter. The Phlegrean fields, according to this ancient myth, are unstable because of the agitated, convulsive movements of these giants. Another area related to myths about the underworld is the nearby Lake of Averno. The door to Hades was said to be found on its shores, blanketed in ancient times with a thick forest. According to Virgil, the Sibyl's Cave was also here, where both Aeneas and Ulysses went to begin their journeys into the underworld. The Magna Graecia was a home to people who not only loved literature and art, music and poetry, architecture and drama, but who appreciated the lush landscape, the open seas, and the tantalizing mythology that came with the territory. For gods and goddesses, and sailors and warriors who came home from the sea, Magna Graecia was almost heaven on earth, an enchanting land, combining a nobility that was all Greece on a palette of exceptional beauty. In Mexico City, during excavation work in 1978 near the cathedral, a heavy slab was unearthed, decorated with magnificent bas-reliefs that someone a very long time ago had smashed and buried. Researchers wondered who could have smashed this beautiful work of art, and why. To find these answers, we have to go back in time to the year 1519, when Mexico City, one of the world's largest and most populated cities, did not yet exist. In its place was an extraordinary and incredible city, Tenochtitlan. This was the capital and the heart of the grandiose Aztec Empire. The monarch, who had the power of life and death over his subjects, was Montezuma II, descendant of another Montezuma, the great leader who founded the empire and built the grand monuments at Tenochtitlan. Like his ancestor, Montezuma was a highly religious sovereign, particularly devoted to the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, to whom hundreds of temples were dedicated. Quetzalcoatl was an extremely benevolent god, the only god in the Aztec pantheon opposed to human sacrifices. The sacred texts state that the god had left the land promising that he would return to redeem his people. And according to the Aztec calendar, the year 1519, by our current calendar, ended one of the sacred cycles. This meant that Quetzalcoatl would soon return, and that's what Montezuma thought when he heard of the floating mountain on the sea. But in 1519, it was not a god that arrived, but conquistador Hernan Cortes. And the floating mountain was a Spanish galleon full of soldiers and weapons. Thinking he was a god, the Aztecs received Cortes with honors and adulation. In return, Cortes went on to destroy the Aztec capital and exterminate its population. Montezuma died, and his successor, Teotihuacan, was forced to surrender. But how was such a rout possible? The invaders wielded devastating weapons and equipment completely unknown to the indigenous population: cannons, rifles, pistols, and horses, which proved to be formidable war machines. The conquistadors inadvertently brought another devastating weapon, a viral disease, smallpox. Smallpox found virgin territory in the New World. Millions died, over 2/3 of the Aztec population. Among them, the last king, Cuauhtémoc, whose death marked the end of the great ancient civilization of the Aztecs. Maybe if there were no disease, the Aztec soldiers might have fared better against the invaders. They were considered noble warriors and often used predators like eagles as their symbols of strength. These 6-foot statues, now in the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, depict how they would have looked. The statues once guarded the gates to a temple called, appropriately, Temple of the Warriors. Tenochtitlan was a grand city that stood in the middle of a large lake on a plateau surrounded by mountains. The first inhabitants of the area were tenacious souls who did not shy away from hardship. They transformed their settlement into one of the most extensive and populous metropolises of the then known world. Their projects included dams, canals, and the draining of swamps. When the soldiers would come back from victorious battles with their spoils of war, they would visit the big market of Tlatelolco. Here they might try to bargain for some precious fabric or rare bird feathers to enrich their attire. Tlatelolco stood at the present site of Mexico City's Plaza de las Tres Culturas. Remains of the ancient Aztec market are still found here, along with traces of a more recent past. Archaeologists have unearthed a main pyramid, rebuilt 14 times, along with other pyramids, platforms, stairs, and altars. In the middle of the plaza stands the Baroque church of Santiago de Tlatelolco, and not far off, the modern-day Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Unfortunately, to build this skyscraper and the adjacent road, the pyramid of Quetzalcoatl and a minor temple dedicated to his worship were sacrificed. Tlatelolco probably wasn't much different from a modern Mexican market. The faces, the voices, the smells, and the many colors of the fruits, vegetables, spices, meats, and other goods for sale are probably the same. Europeans owe the richness of their cuisine to the peoples of America. Until they discovered the New World, they knew nothing of potatoes, tomatoes, corn, peppers, or eggplant. At Tlatelolco, fabrics, skins, pottery, and other commonly used objects were displayed and traded by Aztec merchants called Pochtecans. They would hawk their goods, not for currency like gold coins, but in trade for precious cocoa beans. The market was the commercial heart of their world, but it was also the unfortunate theater for the last desperate resistance by the Aztecs during the siege of their capital in the year 1521. After the Spaniards conquered the area, they started building structures of their own, like the Cathedral of Mexico City. But instead of quarrying for new stones, they used stones from an Aztec temple dedicated to the god Huitzilopochtli. Construction of the cathedral was begun in 1573, but 250 years would pass before it was finished, ending up as a mix of very different styles. In spite of great efforts to consolidate its foundations, the cathedral is now unavoidably sinking into the swampy ground, an ironic end to a monument erected by the conquistadors to erase all traces of the glorious Tenochtitlan. Until the year 1978, it appeared as though the invaders had succeeded in their malicious intent. But then something completely unexpected happened. During excavation work for the Mexico City subway, workers digging a trench near the cathedral stumbled upon pieces of a gigantic and mysterious oval stone with a diameter of over 7 feet and a weight of nearly 9 tons. The stone was immediately identified as an Aztec relic and was truly an extraordinary find, inaugurating a new era for modern Mexican archaeology. The earth would soon yield the ancient vestiges of Tenochtitlan, an exceptional discovery comparable to that of the city of Troy. The archaeologist in charge of the work couldn't have had a more apt name: Eduardo Matos Montezuma. He decided to demolish a whole block of the modern city and give back to Mexicans the heart of their ancient capital. From the many relics that have now been discovered, scientists are able to imagine how the magnificent ancient capital might have looked. The center of Tenochtitlan, situated between the cathedral and the Palacio Nacional on the Grand Plaza of the Zocalo, was mainly a place of worship, full of temples erected on the tops of pyramids with their characteristic steep stairways and colorful wall paintings. The city, at an elevation of over 6,500 feet, was surrounded by the lake, hills, and mountains. It was connected to the mainland by many causeways and interlaced with navigable canals. It was a great metropolis with over 1,200,000 inhabitants. The ceremonial center, Teotihuacan, had many temples dedicated to important gods. The most imposing was the Templo Mayor, the religious heart of Tenochtitlan, the destination for pilgrims and home for priests and divinities. Only priests were allowed to climb to the top of the pyramid and enter the 2 temples. On either side of the temple, there were 2 other sacred constructions dedicated to the gods Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca. Teotihuacan also had dwellings reserved for those in the priesthood and playing fields for an Aztec ball game, which had more of a spiritual meaning than a sporting one. The players were the priests themselves. And lastly, there was the famous Altar of the Skulls, the Tzompantli, where the craniums of human sacrifice victims were displayed. For the Aztecs, religious rites and sacrifices were a necessity, the only way to earn the benevolence of the gods. They believed they were warding off famine, natural disasters, and defeats in battle. And the greatest sacrifice they could make was a human one. The priests made them lie on their backs on narrow sacrificial stones, then cut open their chests and pulled out pulsating hearts as an offering to the idols before them. This description by a Spaniard illustrates one of these sacrifices, made in honor of Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war. There were quite a lot of Aztec gods that demanded human sacrifices. Tlaloc, the god of rain; Coatlicue, the earth goddess, depicted as an old masked woman wearing a narrow skirt tied at the waist with a belt of serpents; Xutecutli, god of fire; Mayahuel, goddess of inebriating beverages, especially the most popular at the time, pulque. The excavation work of ancient Tenochtitlan lasted 5 years and brought to light over 7,000 objects, including sculptures, small artifacts, votive offerings, and the skulls of sacrifice victims. Most of the relics are kept in the very modern Museo del Templo Mayor. The stone that sparked the excavation work is in the place of honor in the center of the museum. The disc is decorated with a bas-relief portraying the goddess Coyolosh Hauqui, she who paints her face with bells, the Aztec moon goddess. Her body appears dismembered on the sculpted surface. According to legend, she was killed and cut to pieces by her brother, the god of war, who held her responsible for having tried to kill their mother, Coatlicue, goddess of the earth. Another wonderful relic in the museum, and the only one of its kind, is this terracotta statue of the Bat God, a divinity of the underworld for worship of the dead. There are also many masks portraying the deceased and mythological beings. The Aztec people were filled with supernatural and mythological tales. Elders spoke of a magical and rich city with splendid palaces that existed right here on Earth. The city was called Teotihuacan, the place where men became gods. These pyramids and ruins are what remains of this once majestic city. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the 6th largest city in the world. When the Aztecs lived, the place was abandoned, partially swallowed up by the jungle. But the Aztecs still believed that the incredible pyramids were built by the gods thousands of years earlier, and they made pilgrimages to the site. Archaeologists found that the city of Teotihuacan was established in 200 BC by the peoples of the Mexico Valley. The pyramids, some of the most extraordinary monuments in the Americas, were built around 200 AD. At its zenith, Teotihuacan had grown to cover an area of almost 8 square miles and had almost 200,000 inhabitants. The monumental complex lies in the high Anahuac Valley in a barren and arid landscape that heightens its magical and mysterious atmosphere. It now attracts numerous people who gather here regularly to celebrate the rite of the Salute to the Sun. The city is bisected by a grand avenue, 130 feet wide and over a mile long, that is called the Avenue of the Dead. To the east stands Tepantitla, a building complex rich in murals. The paintings depict Tlalocan, a paradise with abundant water, butterflies, and flowers. Tlalocan was the world that was governed by Tlaloc, the god of rain. At the end of the Avenue of the Dead is the Ciutadela, the citadel, at whose center stands the pyramid dedicated to the god Quetzalcoatl. It is one of the most important buildings in the area. Next to its base are statues carved out of limestone and painted with natural pigments that used to decorate the pyramid. They represent the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl. Originally, they were painted in bright colors. The undulating bodies of the serpents emerged from the walls of the pyramids, and the god's head was wreathed in a crown of feathers. In 1986, the excavations of the Teotihuacan yielded an exceptional find, a sepulchre with the skeletons of 18 priests killed during a sacrifice. Until then, it was believed that only prisoners, slaves, or enemies were sacrificed on the altars. Here was proof that the rite of sacrifice did not discriminate. The most imposing sight, however, is in the Plaza del Sol. Along with the ruins of an altar and several temples stands the Pyramid of the Sun. 230 feet tall, 740 feet long on each side of the base, it is almost as big as the Egyptian Pyramid of Cheops at Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the world. Thousands of tourists make the steep but memorable climb to the top, a perfect place to take in the majesty of the entire complex. Ancient civilizations believed that both the sun and the moon were created at this site. From here you can also see the other great pyramid of Teotihuacan, the Pyramid of the Moon. Smaller than the Sun Pyramid, it's 130 feet high with a square base measuring 460 feet on each side. Yet despite these structures that have seemed to last an eternity, no one has figured out why the city and the culture disappeared so suddenly. The end apparently came around 750 AD. Some archaeologists feel the city was destroyed and burned, and its inhabitants fled. But no one knows who was responsible for the massacre, or what became of the survivors. Other experts have linked the decline of Teotihuacan simply to a change in the climate, which may have caused the already dry area to become uninhabitable. But that would not explain the fires and the devastation. Thus, the mystery of the lost city of Teotihuacan, where men became gods, lives on. One of the most incredible finds in the history of Mexican archaeology is the Sunstone. Miraculously escaping the fury of the Spanish, it was found in 1790 in Mexico City and incorporated into the eastern facade of the cathedral. The fascinating symbols incised into this Aztec treasure placed it at the center of numerous religious events. The relic can now be seen at the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, a museum that contains many testaments to the origins and the histories of the peoples who populated Central America over the course of the millennia. A beautifully sculpted monkey-shaped receptacle made of extremely fragile black obsidian, heads carved in volcanic rock with eyes and teeth made of mother of pearl and pupils of pyrite, terracotta pipes, musical instruments, and thousands of other objects from the great Aztec culture. But perhaps the most precious is the Sunstone. Archaeologists studied the disk for years in an attempt to reveal the mystery of its symbols. Today, they think they have the answer. The Sunstone is a calendar, actually a double calendar. The complicated symbols refer both to a division of time based on religious precepts, where the solar year is 260 days long, and to a non-religious one, which divides the year exactly into 365 days. Other symbols describe the life of the planet, breaking it down into 5 solar ages, the so-called cosmogonic suns, and date the creation of the world to the 13th of August, 3114 BC, and its end to the 22nd of December, 2012. There are different interpretations. And there are certainly many mysteries still hidden in the signs inscribed on the sunstone by wise hands. Perhaps time alone can give us the final answer. Mexico City today is one of the world's largest capitals, and unfortunately, one of the most polluted, with millions of vehicles. It is a city of contradictions, where skyscrapers crowd the center and miserable shanties form a belt in the vast outskirts. Much has been done to restore dignity to the Indios, the direct descendants of the Aztecs, but the wounds inflicted by a brutal conquest half a millennium ago are still visible everywhere you look. There is one area, however, in the south of the city, where one can still find solace in the ancient ways. Called Xochimilco, this part of the modern city still conserves characteristics of the ancient Tenochtitlan. It has canals that wind among the chinampas, the floating gardens that were obtained by draining the swampland, the same technique that allowed the Aztecs to create their capital. On Sundays, the zone becomes crowded with people having their meals on brightly colored boats, with mariachi bands playing music, singing of unrequited love, sad songs, just like this poem written over 500 years ago by an Aztec prince. Shall I thus pass away like the flowers that fade? Will there be nothing left of my name, nothing of my fame on earth? Let there at least be flowers. Let there at least be song. What can my heart do? Without purpose, we passed through this world. But they did have a purpose. The Aztec warriors and the rulers who gave their lives in defense of this great civilization may indeed have felt a desperation at the end. But there is something left of their fame on earth. And the flowers are here too. But they're made of stone, and they're called pyramids. And they have the sun to crown them for all eternity.